It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Oh man, it's October. It's the month I love watching me some horror movies and enjoying jacket weather and chilly nights and stupid ghost hunting shows on cable and AMC Fright Fest where they show all sorts of horror movies edited all to hell. What can I say? This is a time of year I get really nostalgic for movies like this week's featured flick, Evil Dead 2. So last week I talked about 1981's The Evil Dead, and I mentioned how the first film kind of seemed to have gained more popularity over the last couple of decades compared to when I was a kid. And the reason why I feel that way is that Evil Dead 2 was one that gained a lot of positive attention in right away when it was released and in the years that followed its release. By the early 90s, it was treated as a masterpiece. And there are two things I can point to that give credence to how highly this film was received once it was released in spring of 1987. First, for the better part of the last year and a half or so, I've been watching a lot of older Siskel and Ebert episodes on YouTube. On one of their 1992 episodes, they did one of their Guilty Pleasures episode. And on that, Ebert in particular featured Evil Dead 2. Now, they had already featured the movie before when it was released in 1987, but it got a second look on this episode. And it was Ebert who was especially enamored with a lot of what was in the film. Now, keep in mind, Ebert wrote a couple of Russ Meyer's films, so he was particularly drawn to some of the more exploitation elements of Raimi's work. This definitely helped get the movie some extra legs 5 years after its release. Also, 1992 would end up being the year that its follow-up, Army of Darkness, was released. However, for me, there is something else that made this movie seem to be a pretty big deal before I actually saw it for myself. In October of what I want to say was probably 1990 or 1991, or thereabouts at least, early 90s for sure, MTV did a thing in October on every Friday and Saturday night where they had themed shows. Of course, Headbangers Ball was always going to go all in for Halloween, but this show that I was thinking about came on before that and talked about various topics. Seems like one episode maybe would go more into the folklore behind some horror figures. Another show would go into specific movies. Yet another one talked about specific filmmakers. Anyway, this is where I learned about people like Dario Argento and his movie Suspiria. It's where I learned about stuff that Stuart Gordon made, like Reanimator and From Beyond. But it's also where I learned about Evil Dead, and more specifically, Evil Dead 2. There were shows like that on MTV that I wish I could find again online or just someplace. The two shows I always remember best, and shows I've talked about before on the Film Seizure Podcast, were those horror movie short documentaries during that October and the 1991 summer movie special that was likely an hour-long episode of The Big Picture with Chris Connolly. But anyway, what makes Evil Dead 2 is really kind of twofold. The first is that it isn't just a movie with ghastly beasties and serious horror elements and gore. It's also a comedy. While maybe not as comedic as, say, Army of Darkness would be, Evil Dead 2 is definitely a movie with a pretty solid funny bone in its skeleton. Comedy is not something that was totally absent from horror in the 80s, but most 80s horror films were more interested in how far they could push the terror and the gore and still get that R rating. Sure, characters would drop a sarcastic line or something to chuckle at, but Evil Dead 2 seemed to navigate this concept in a completely different way. It becomes a total entertainment experience. You're going to be a little bit scared, you're going to laugh, and even when things get really gory, you'll probably still laugh even harder. It's perfectly balanced in that way, and it really did make Sam Raimi a force to be reckoned with. The other interesting thing about Evil Dead 2 is that it lies somewhere between reimagining, reboot, and remake of the first film. It's maybe one of the very first examples of the more modern term requel. as we learned last time, Ash Williams and his girlfriend Linda and their friends, which includes Ash's sister Cheryl, went on a vacation to a cabin way out in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee. Of course, from there, spooky shenanigans take place. Well, as we're about to find out, we're going to see a couple of the same events in this movie, or at least to be somewhat similar or continue on from the previous movie. So, really, unless Ash vs. the Evil Dead TV show says otherwise, the second movie starts as a remake to kind of set the tone, and then it goes on to expand upon the story. You can watch all the movies and the other stuff, or just start with the second movie and move forward from there. It's perfectly fine. The movie opens with a background story about the Book of the Dead, Necronomicon Ex Mortis. It said the book was written in blood and bound in flesh, and the book went missing at some point over the last several hundred years. That's when we see Ash Williams traveling to a cabin in the woods with his girlfriend Linda, and everything seems to be going fairly nicely at the cabin. Ash plays piano as Linda dances in her underwear. After, Linda worries the people who own the cabin will suddenly come home, but Ash says there's nothing to worry about. Those people aren't going to be coming back. She goes to take a shower while Ash discovers a tape player on the desk, and he begins playing the recording that we hear from Professor Noby as the professor talks about the Book of the Dead. Now, next to the recorder is the book itself. In the recording, Noby reads the same incantation that we heard in the first film, and as he does, an unseen entity zooms through the woods and breaks into the window to abduct a screaming Linda. When Ash goes out into the woods to try to find her and see what happened, he's attacked by a possessed demonic Linda. In defending himself, he uses a shovel that decapitates Linda, and then he buries her out in the woods. The next morning, similarly to how we saw Ash leaving the cabin and being attacked by the unseen entity in the first film, he's actually picked up and thrown against a tree where he lands in a puddle of water. He's been possessed and he looks like a deadite, but the morning sun burns the possession away and he reverts to his normal self, as whatever was possessing the woods itself recedes off into the distance. When Ash comes to, he looks around to see that he's alone in the forest, and he figures that it was probably the sun that saved him, and he continues to hear the disembodied voice of the entity, basically telling him to join them. So he does what anyone else would do and decides to beat cheeks. As he drives to the bridge, that is part of the road that's the only way out from this cabin, he finds that the bridge is completely destroyed. The sun is also setting fast, so the entity approaches again, but Ash is able to successfully drive away from it in his car, but he wrecks the car on a tree stump and is thrown out through the windshield. He runs away from the entity into the cabin as it chases him around, and when Ash hides, the entity is confused, so it decides to just simply leave the cabin and go back out into the woods. Where Ash ended up hiding was in the trap door that goes to the cellar, the very famous trap door that we saw in the first movie. While Ash sneaks around the cabin as he hides out from the entity, Professor Noby's daughter Annie and her research partner Ed returned from an expedition with some missing pages from the Necronomicon. Back at the cabin's piano begins playing by itself. It's the same song as the one that Ash played for the dancing Linda, and he watches her body exit from her grave and do the same ballet dances before seemingly floating away until she suddenly appears at the window and tries to attack Ash. Suddenly, Ash wakes up realizing it was all a nightmare until Linda's decapitated head lands on his lap and bites his hand. She won't let go, so he has to go to the work shed where he places her head in the vise, and he plans to use the chainsaw to destroy the head. Well, he can't find it because Linda's body comes busting in through the door of the shed to attack him with it until it ends up slipping and making a goof, and the chainsaw falls back onto its own neck, killing itself. But soon, Ash's right hand is possessed from Linda biting it, and it starts attacking him like one of the Three Stooges has control over it. It tries smashing plates over his head, throwing him around by his hair, and eventually spots a cleaver it wants to use to kill Ash. Just before it can grab the cleaver, Ash stabs the hand and then uses the chainsaw to cut it off. Meanwhile, Annie and Ed get help to get to the cabin by a couple of yokels, Jake and Bobby Joe, who know a path to get to the Nobi cabin. They arrive at the cabin to find a crazed one-handed Ash Williams brandishing a shotgun. After knocking Ash out, they throw him into the cellar. And as he is coming to, Annie plays the recording her dad was making about using the Necronomicon, and she learns that her mother, Henrietta, became possessed and the professor couldn't bring himself to dismember her, so he had to bury her in the cellar. And that's when Henrietta reanimates and starts coming after Ash, but he's saved by the others. And they end up chaining Henrietta into the cellar, much like they did with Ash's sister in the first movie. And Ash tells everyone they can't leave until daylight. And that's when Henrietta tries to trick Annie into letting her out of the cellar by reverting back to her normal self. But soon, thanks to the injuries sustained in trying to lock Henrietta away, Ed becomes a deadite and bites a chunk of Bobby Joe's hair out of her head. But Ash saves them by using an axe on the possessed Ed, hacking him to pieces. But suddenly there's a loud pounding sound, whooshing and lightning, and Ash figures something is trying to force its way into the world. And when a bedroom door opens itself ever so slightly, he and Annie go to investigate. And they are confronted by the ghost of Professor Nobi, who tells Annie that their only salvation is in the missing pages from the Necronomicon that she recovered from the dig site. Now, Bobby Joe is attacked by Ash's disembodied hand, and in the confusion and darkness, she runs out of the cabin and into the woods. There, she gets grabbed by the vines and tree branches and dragged off into the woods, where it appears that she's rammed into a tree's trunk, killing her. Annie begins looking through the pages she brought with her, and she tells Ash about a drawing in it from the 13th century about a man who they called the hero from the sky that destroyed the evil way back then. Jake, more concerned about finding Bobby Joe, takes Annie and Ash by gunpoint and throws the pages of the book into the cellar so they can help him look for Bobby Joe in the woods. While outside, Ash gets possessed once again and attacks Jake while Annie runs back to the cabin. Now, believing that she's defending herself against evil Ash, Annie accidentally stabs Jake with that ceremonial dagger that we saw in the first movie with the skull on the end of the handle. She drags Jake into the living room to get the axe to kill evil Ash, but Jake's dragged into the cellar by Henrietta, who also turns him into a geyser of blood. Ash catches up to Annie and throws her against the wall, but before he can finish her off, he finds the necklace that he gave to Linda on the trip to the cabin, and it causes him to revert back to his normal self. So in order for Annie and Ash to get into the cellar to fend off Henrietta and retrieve the pages of the Necronomicon, Ash has to modify the chainsaw so that it can attach to his stub where his hand used to be. And he goes into the cellar to pick up the pages, and as Annie begins to recite the incantation to defeat the demon in control of the Deadites, Henrietta attacks Ash and then Annie. But Ash comes up from the basement and takes on Henrietta specifically, and Annie distracts the far more demonic and rubber-necky Henrietta monster long enough for Ash to dismember the demon and shoot it in the head to explode its brains and face and bits all over. Annie starts working on the incantations when the trees in the woods begin destroying the cabin. Ash's evil hand stabs Annie in the back with that ceremonial dagger thing, and before she dies, she finishes the incantation, which opens up a large portal that sucks the big boss demon into it, along with Ash and his Oldsmobile. He and his Oldsmobile land in the 13th century, and at first the knights who find him think that he's a Deadite until he destroys one that is flying overhead. He's then heralded as a hero from the sky, but Ash can only scream as he realizes he's trapped in the past to become the fabled hero, and his fight against the Deadites is long from over. So let's talk about the three things that I like about Evil Dead 2. Now, my first pick is how fast-paced this movie is. This is a frenetic movie, almost from the moment that the movie begins. So, I mentioned earlier this is something of a requel, where it's part remake and part sequel, and that was a really smart way to go. For one, if there was something that could be expanded upon from the first movie, it's absolutely some of the more weirder stuff that happens in the third act. The first half of the movie or so here plays out like a longer version of that sequence in the original, where Ash is alone and being driven mad by the demons and the entity making noises and other strange things happening inside the cabin with him. Bruce Campbell alone and fighting against himself is also pretty great. I'll have more to say about that here in a minute, but it really truly is amazing to see the difference in his performance and confidence as a professional actor by this time between the two movies. And that's one of the great things also, is that, that really plays into the pace. He can be more verbose because the pacing is more verbose, and it's perfect. Second, the creature work and effects are fantastic in this movie. The first movie had much more simplistic creature effects. They had contacts to make their eyes white, and they were mostly given a fairly basic look with cuts and slices or what have you, along with some pale skin. It's still a creepy look, but this movie really kicks that up a notch. You have heavy prosthetics on people's faces to make their eyes sunken in, and almost to kind of give them a small snout of sorts, to give them a bunch of nasty teeth. You've got Sam's brother Ted Raimi in a fat suit as the possessed Henrietta. You have puppeteered giant monsters and tree monsters. Of course, there's stop motion animation. There's an evil hand. It's great. And while it may seem that these things may come across as a little outdated, 35, 36 years on, it really isn't. These creatures still look really, really good today, and all of the effects still stand out as real achievements for this movie. Thirdly, like with the special effects being a mix of a lot of different techniques, the movie's sense of humor is also a grab bag of a lot of different styles. You have Bruce Campbell going through the ringer by being thrown against trees. He's bashing himself over the head with plates. He's cutting off his own hand. He's getting blasted in the face by blood spraying out of the wall. It's kind of funny because, like, every time you think something should be taken particularly seriously, or something is going to come across as really, really scary or really, really freaky, Sam Raimi throws something in that's really funny. Like when Ash gets picked up at the early part of the movie and he's like whipped through the forest, and he eventually gets slammed up against a tree where he ends up face down in the puddle. He's flying along and you think, wow, this is really cool and this is really neat. And then all of a sudden they spin Bruce Campbell around like in a circle, and it's totally unnecessary, but it lightens the mood a little bit. It breaks that tension, and it's a great thing to add. Also, in the midst of the cabin driving him crazy, Ash is kind of laughing along with the rest of the demon possessed stuff on the walls and in the cabin. Later, he gets possessed, and even how he attacks Annie is physical comedy, and how he pops into frame and the facial expression he's making. When he reverts back to normal, Annie continues trying to kill him, and that turns out to be funny because, he has to now prove to her that he's doing fine. There's another scene when Henrietta attacks and they're trying to force her into the cellar, and her head's kind of sticking out of the trap door. And so they're like, trying to jump on the trap door to force her down. And one of her eyeballs pops out, and it doesn't just pop out and then like fly across the room and hit the wall or fall onto the floor. No, it flies into Bobby Joe's mouth. And just stuff like that, as gross as that is in concept, it turns out to be extraordinarily funny. And as goofy as that could come out to be, it actually comes out perfectly timed and perfectly done. And it's just brilliant. several times during the course of the movie when Ash and Annie and Bobby Joe and Jay and the other guy that Bobby Joe's with, I think his name's Jake, when they are, like hearing things in the room or something is happening off camera, the way they're jerking their heads around is all comedic, and it's great. And you can really tell that Raimi and team was having a blast making this movie. Any scary movie can startle you with a proper jump scare, but why not have a little bit of fun while you're at it? Why not treat the monsters like Looney Tunes cartoons? Why not throw in some Three Stooges style slapstick while you're at it? Evil Dead 2 is a very unique movie that perfectly blends horror and comedy and makes you feel kind of like Bruce Campbell's Ash in your own incredulity of what's happening around you. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com, and you can also listen to new episodes of Film Seizure each Wednesday morning, also at filmseizure.com. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast as well as Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we really get into the Halloween spirit when I take a visit to a new attraction in a small New York town. Join me as I check out Hell House LLC. Until next week, stay spooky.